My name is Laura Wilkes D'Amato, and I am a student in VCPC's Practicum 2 right now. I'm a third-year law student, and I'm in the clinic with my team back there. We have Amber Leisure Earnhardt and Kristen McCarthy, Lauren Acker, and Kelsey Thwaites. This semester, we've been really privileged and honored to be working with the Pamunkey tribe, who are local to us here in the area, and we've been doing some research for them. And we have had just such a great experience working with them, partnering in resilience, and we're thrilled that they're here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chief Robert Gray and Dr. Ashley Spivey. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm the first one to get to say good afternoon. And it's still early after lunch, so nobody's quite digesting just yet and falling asleep, so I know my voice can get kind of monotone. All right, I guess where was it at? Now I have to learn. Hit that. There we go. I just wanted to give you just a brief history of the tribe. We're a fairly small tribal community. Approximately 400 plus members nationwide. About 60 tribal members live on the reservation, and that is the reservation as you see it there. It's about 1,200 acres. As you see it, it's a marshland peninsula surrounded by the Pamunkey River. That landmass and quite a bit more that we no longer have was established via treaty negotiations all the way back in 1646 with the Crown of England. We've been basically whittled down to this 1,200 acres, majority which you can tell by the colors is primarily marshland and such. But like I said, about 60 tribal members living on the reservation. The 400 off, our membership extends from Florida to Alaska, Southern California, up to Massachusetts. So we're a little bit all over the place. I covered it up. Did it go? When we look at our natural resources, it's almost impossible to separate natural resources from our cultural resources. And that's primarily because just how our tribe has managed those natural resources for years. It's an inherent part of our culture. To give you a little bit about our culture, in about the late 19th century, tribal leadership started to see a need to maintain culture. Chief George Major Cook was one of the key personnel that started collecting artifacts and such in his own home, passed them down to his son, Chief Tecumseh Deerfoot Cook. A lot of you all may have recognized that name. Passed it down to his son, Warren Cook, who in 1980, we opened up our museum with those artifacts plus a lot more. And a lot of those artifacts reflect the natural resources around us. Another thing that we operate, and you see some pictures there, is the shad hatchery. As early as 1908, the tribe, shad fishing was a major component for centuries for the Pamunkey people and other Native Americans in the area. Both for sustenance, basically eating, and then it got to be a economic driver. At some point, you don't want to eat fish all the time, so you catch fish, sell it to somebody else, then maybe you can go out and buy a steak. But by about 1908, we even started seeing a reduction in the shad populations. And the tribe felt it needed to do something, and we started a low-scale hatchery operation. It was just operating out of basically buckets filled with the roe eggs and such. We appealed to the Virginia lawmakers to help. I'm not quite sure at that early stage if the Commonwealth of Virginia saw the problem that we did. By 1917, we organized even better and mechanized our hatchery operations with a gas motor to circulate air and such. So that's how early we were doing it. And by oral history, by 1922, we were seeing an improvement in the shad in the river. Basically, our fishermen understood there was a balance between conservation and continued use of the shad for their own purposes. And it was a profitable economic practice, not just on our river. Our tribal members, our fishermen would travel up the coast, up to the Hudson River, Susquehanna, and follow the shad and fish and make money and bring it back to support their families. Our hatchery was so successful that other hatcheries were coming to us, asking for advice. The 1990s were about our heyday. We were really putting out a lot of shad eggs. And just to let you know, I may have to cover, our hatchery wasn't raising large shad. We were just basically helping the fertilization of the eggs, let them live up to about 1/4 inch or so fry, and then release them right back in the river. Our hatchery ate it in stocking James River, the Susquehanna, the Potomac. They were coming, taking eggs from us. Well, they weren't taking, we were working with all these various agencies. We were receiving funds from NOAA for our operations, and we were also receiving annual funds from the state, but that dried up 2012. And a lot of that dry up was just because everywhere here in Virginia, shad runs were diminishing, and the state just was diverting the money. So basically we had a lack of shad in the river despite all our efforts. The shad runs were getting smaller and smaller. We had a lack of money without a lot of these outside sources, and without that money we were losing our fishermen. Right now we have 90-year-old man going out every year fishing or running the hatchery, and primarily it's some older ones. There's, right at this moment, it's just hard to say, there's not enough money to attract the young people to keep up the practice. Over the last couple centuries, we've been fighting at times with the Commonwealth of Virginia for our treaty rights, as I said, the sustenance and such. And we, every so often, we have to remind the state about the treaty rights. And the most recent example was a few years back, Game and Fish asked for an Attorney General's opinion on their jurisdiction over our fishing practices. Then Attorney General Cuccinelli gave the opinion that they fall under state law. Basically, he ignored the treaty. We sat back. We were ready to go to battle over that one, but you don't go to battle over just someone's opinion, Attorney General or not. We were heartened to find all the local court systems in the area basically told Game and Fish, if you bring a case to my court about the tribes, we're going to dismiss it. So that saved us a lot of the legal battle. And Game and Fish, I think, caught the message and said, well, let's not even bother the Indians. It's not even going to be worth the effort. Now, the latest news we've had, in 2015, we achieved federal recognition. We had been state recognized for all this time, and federal recognition for us gives us access to programs that especially related to the issues that we're here today to talk about. I'll give a couple examples. Well, primarily that federal funding can be used for the benefit of the entire region, and that's not just our little 1,200 acres, economy of scale. During the first panel, we were hearing, actually all the panels, we were hearing about septic systems. We have direct access to the public health arm of Indian Health Service, which is under Health and Human Services, and we're working with them on our septic systems and our well systems on the reservation and other tribal members within King William County. We've been hearing about roads. Bureau of Indian Affairs has a transportation division, and when we get land into trust, those roads can go under the BIA's transportation inventory, but what is really great is the state roads that provide access to our land can also be put on the BIA inventory. At the same time, they're on the state inventory. What does that mean? More funding. The state gets their funding for the roads, and we can contribute to that from BIA funds. So these are ways that we can work with the local King William County at this point in time. Let me see what else I want to cover. But that's basically the idea. We're hoping to work with the local communities because a lot of these problems that we're hearing, we're experiencing ourselves. I'm sitting there, I was just saying, you know, I'm hearing about ditches, and I gotta go home, look at the ditch in front of my house that's been filling in, heavy rain, there's water standing on the road. I thought it was great ditches were filling in, because then the skunks aren't getting in the pipe under my driveway. But maybe I need to get a shovel out there and do some digging. Just let you know, Chief and Council, just like any organization, we run the strategy. You know, the 50,000 foot level for managing tribal issues and such. But we are extremely fortunate to have someone of Dr. Spivey's experience and education to help us. I come from a military background, and I think the people who work for me recognize that on a daily basis. But before we even achieved federal recognition, Dr. Spivey saw a need for capacity building. We were plodding along as a state-recognized tribe, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were just maintaining. Federal recognition, we were in NASCAR territory. And she saw a need and volunteered her time to write a grant for capacity building for the tribe. And that capacity building, I liken it to having to create the bureaucracy. That nobody likes bureaucracy, but you need it to properly manage your human resources, physical resources, even your financial resources. And that's what she and her team have been doing, working for this grant. I was so glad to see this morning that she brought almost all her team from the Tribal Resource Center here. The only one that's missing is my own daughter, but her husband had a death in the family, so I'll give her a pass. But she's been doing great. She keeps us straight, and I'm going to let her, she's the scientist. She's a graduate of William & Mary, doctorate in anthropology and archaeology here. So I leave all the scientific things to her, and I think she'll give you a lot of great information. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank the Virginia Coastal Policy Center, particularly Elizabeth and Angela, for inviting us to be here today, and also contacting us to offer, their support, their services, and their students to help with some needs that we do have. So, Chief Gray, again, also want to thank you for that really wonderful introduction. Sometimes I wonder if I can make it another day with all the stuff that we do, because it's a lot. It's a lot on me and my small team of 4 staff. We do a lot for the tribe. And as he mentioned, without the grant, it's a ANA SEDS, okay, Administration for Native Americans Social and Economic Development Strategies grant through Health and Human Services. Without that grant, we would not have the Tribal Resource Center. That is the center that I direct that's located on a reservation. We would not have that. We would not have the staff to run that office, and therefore have the programs that I'm going to introduce to you guys today that are very much related to the Pamunkey Indian tribe's attempts to help build a resilient Virginia. So thank you guys for allowing me to be here, and for Chief Gray to be here, and my staff to be here to help share our journey. Because these are things that we're dealing with now, here in the now. Everything that you guys are used to, that you've been hearing about, we're dealing with them, and we're actually coming up with some solutions on how to address them. Okay, so what thing do I use? Sorry, I should have asked that first. This thingy, okay.
So that advances it.
Got it. All right. So Chief Gray give you guys a very quick introduction to some of our stewardship and sustainability efforts that we've done throughout our tribe's history. We're continuing those efforts today, but we're facing new challenges, just like all of our communities are when it comes to climate change. So I have a list: sea level rise, severe weather events, flooding, rapid erosion. We are a marshland peninsula. We're having issues with certain parts of our reservation boundaries that are our shoreline, that are eroding at a rapid pace into the Pamunkey River that surrounds the reservation. And as I stated, these are not future issues that we're anticipating. These are things that we are dealing with right now, and they're not just impacting the landscape or the natural resources, they're impacting our cultural fabric. Without this place and without this river, we would not have survived. It is the foundation of who we are as a tribe. And it's affecting, our archaeological resources, it's affecting the species that we hold dear to our survival as a Native people, and it's affecting cultural practices as well. So I want to go over some examples of what we're doing to face these issues and to deal with these issues. And I also want to emphasize that, as Chief Graham mentioned, that we don't look as natural and cultural resources as something that's separate. We want to look at them as something that's integrated. So we're actively taking management strategies to make sure that that happens. All right. So how are we addressing some of these issues? So at the very heart of it is that tribal capacity building and administrative capacity building. We, through that grant, through my office, have developed program area working groups that are comprised of tribal member representatives, tribal government representatives, and tribal resource center staff. And basically, it's all volunteer basis, because we just don't have the manpower or the funding to actually set up these separate departments that, quite frankly, we need. That's for the future. But the purpose of the natural resource group, the cultural resource management group, is to aid the tribe in managing the workload that's affiliated with programs related to these issues. All right. So honestly, without the capacity building, and then also without the partnerships that we've been able to build through paid staff at the TRC, a lot of the programs that I'm going to go over with you guys would not be possible. I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. I'd be talking about one thing instead of 5 things. So just to recognize some of our partners that we've been working with for the past few years, I'm gonna probably forget some, so forgive me, or you guys yell out and remind me. I can't see it. I guess I can look this way. So the College of William & Mary, definitely. I also serve as the college's tribal liaison, so I've been really lucky to have my relationships with the college maintained, particularly with the anthropology department, with VIMS, definitely. There's some of our partners that we're working with directly here in this room. Thank you guys, you know who you are. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Let's see, Preservation Virginia, which is a conservation preservation nonprofit group. Data Investigations, LLC, which is actually a cultural resource management firm that has helped us tremendously on the reservation, and I'll get into why that's important. Chesapeake Scientific, which is owned and operated by Christian Hager, who is a marine biologist, and I'll get into some of the work we're doing with him, and then also St. Mary's College and the National Park Service. Okay, so one of the first programs I'd like to introduce you guys to is the Archaeological Shoreline Survey. Now, I mentioned that we're dealing with severe rapid erosion. We recognized immediately that one of the resources that was going to be impacted by that is our archaeological record, right? Our archaeological record is our history. It tells us about who we were, how we lived, and it's a non-renewable resource. When it's gone, it's gone. So we wanted to do what we could to record the archaeological record located along the shoreline, because we're losing those resources and those sites. So, I do want to mention that, because this is particularly relevant, the reservation, which is actually the oldest continually occupied Indian reservation in the United States, so in my opinion, it should be a national landmark. That's just my opinion, and I'm biased. It is on the National Register of Historic Places as an archaeological district. But the survey that has been done there, that predominantly happened in 1979, is extremely limited. So we knew that we need to get funding and we need to get partners in to help us record our resources. So with the help of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, we applied for a grant through the Cultural Resource Fund and got money to do a shoreline survey of the reservation. And we hired William & Mary Center for Archaeological Research. So they led the excavations and the survey. And as you'll see kind of as a theme throughout some of these programs, we always try to incorporate a component where tribal members can be hired, because it's needed. And it's not just needed that people need jobs, we need people trained in these areas. So it's also an effort to have people trained from our actual tribal community, so that we're not always going to be reliant on those outside of us. Let's see. So we were able to record sites that were located along the shoreline, and we definitely were able to find new archaeological sites that had not been recorded prior to this survey. But unfortunately, we also discovered that some sites have been completely eroded into the Pamunkey River. We have lost several. The artifacts are there, but I don't know if I'm an archaeologist, I'm not an environmental scientist, so I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the thing called stratigraphy. That tells you the history literally in the ground of how people have lived over time, those deposits in the ground. And when you lose I can't say it. I have a PhD in it, but I can't say it. Stratigraphy. When you lose that, you lose provenience for your artifacts. So you have a lot of cool looking things, but they don't tell you anything because you don't know when they were made, how they were made, and what context that they were made. So that was unfortunate. Related to that, we've been working with the National Park Service and St. Mary's College to do an Indigenous Cultural Landscapes project. And this is a project that's focused on historic research on native places and spaces that are located in the York River system. So the Pamunkey River is a tributary to the York, so it's one of those areas that they want to focus on. So for us, we wanted to focus on the reservation and immediately off the reservation to do oral history with our tribal elders to look at spaces and places that were culturally and naturally important to the history of the tribe and important to us now, so that we can have those for future generations. Because we're losing the people with that knowledge, and unfortunately, we're losing the spaces and the places that hold that history. So some of the information that we were focused on included historic architecture and house sites, archaeological sites, as I've already mentioned, traditional cultural properties. So these are spaces that we consider to be absolutely paramount to our culture. So for example, we have several sites on the reservation where women have been getting the men to dig clay along our shoreline for our pottery making purposes. We consider those traditional cultural properties, and those are eroding into the river. So these two particular things that I think some people might not consider as directly related to climate change or sea level rise are very much related to that. So the purpose of these types of projects is for recording, because it's not a matter of if it's lost, it's a matter of when it's lost. So we're trying to do the foundational work to ensure that this information and that these places and these spaces are recorded for future generations. One of the other components of our culture and our natural resources that are affected are the species that we consider to be historically important to us. So one of the projects that we're also working on, actually currently, these other two projects I mentioned are kind of wrapping up, but we're working with Chesapeake Scientific on a sturgeon species recovery grant. And this is funded through a grant through NOAA. And again, we were able to hire 3 tribal members through this grant to get trained in working with Atlantic sturgeon. The purpose is to tag and track the Atlantic sturgeon, map the river bottom, so that we can better understand spawning habitats and also potentially look at contributions to why the Atlantic sturgeon maybe aren't thriving anymore. We have an idea, obviously, but we want to get the data so that we can get more funding to actually help, hopefully, repopulate that species if possible. We've also been working with the EPA through their Indian General Assistance Program called IGAP. This is an endeavor that's been heavily managed by my assistant director, Lauren Porter, who's here. You can wave. Hi. Without her, this project would not have come to fruition because we were the first federally recognized tribe in EPA's Region 3. So there was a lot of legwork, and I think Lauren would agree with me, that needed to be done in order to get this general assistance program up and running. So for right now, the program is going to focus on an integrated waste management plan for the tribe. It's going to focus on solid waste. We're going to focus on outreach and education to tribal members so we can help manage on a individual level our issues with waste management, so composting, recycling, refuse. It's going to help us fund an EPA tribal environmental plan for the tribe, and it's also the foundation for establishing an Office of Environmental Protection. Through this work, we can get additional grant funding to help with other initiatives And it's also working towards us getting treatment as a state under EPA. And this is particularly important for the tribe because then we won't be able to we won't have to just work through EPA. And we won't just have to focus on projects that are just within our 1,200-acre reservation. We will be able to influence projects, policy that are going to affect the reservation in a much larger geographic region. So that's something that we're working towards. Okay. And this is just a small sample of what we're doing. We have a lot more going on. I'm tired. I know my staff is tired. It's all worth it though. Some of our plans for the future. So shoreline stabilization and restoration. This is also going to be key. I say for the future because we have just started working, not through my office, but through another tribal member on a shoreline stabilization and restoration project that's funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Small Watersheds Grant. So she, along with folks from VIMS, are actively working on the phase 1 of that. So we've got 2 sites along our shoreline that will be getting a breakwater system in place, and also a living shoreline will be developed as well. We're also going to be working more with VIMS on a tribal wetlands management program. I'm looking at the man right now, Mr. Kirk Havens, that's going to help us with that. We're definitely going to be continuing to work on the shad hatchery maintenance and also expanding it. I would hate to see that institution that is now a century old fall to nothing. We have to be the stewards again that we were over 100 years ago and do everything that we can to help that species that has really kind of been the backbone of, again, the tribe's survival for over a century now. We're also going to be establishing a public health and safety working group that's going to work with the administrative office on the reservation to aid in the management of our great infrastructure issues that we heard a lot about today, septic being a main one of those issues. So we are also facing that as well. And before I leave, because I know we want to do question and answer for a few minutes at least, hopefully, I just want to make sure that you all take away 3 particular major points from the hodgepodge of projects that I just mentioned, and why they're relevant and why they're all related, and why they mean something to the discussion today. So personally, I wanted to demonstrate for you all who are kind of in the thick of all of these issues, who are expert in all these issues. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an expert. I'm just helping to facilitate what I can, where I can. But I want to demonstrate what a small tribal community is doing and has been doing to contribute to these challenges. We're doing it on a small scale, but we're doing something about it. And I will emphasize that we're doing these things with an extreme lack in resources. Money. It always comes down to money, but also people, having the people to be on the ground to help us do these things. And I also want to emphasize that we are part of this story too. We are a part of these challenges too. I think that unfortunately in Virginia's indigenous communities are not considered or actively engaged in these types of conversations. So I wanted to demonstrate that look at what we're doing. We can be a resource. We need resources, but we can also be a resource for you all. And I also want to just provide a reminder that the reservation, this 1,200-acre marshland peninsula, is just a small part of what we consider to be our ancestral lands and our ancestral territory. So we feel that we have a stake in what's going on beyond that 1,200 acres, and we want you all to know that. We want to be a part of the conversation. We want to be a part of the solution. So thank you for allowing me to be here today to introduce that to you all. Thanks.
Thank you both very much for sharing that. What a wonderful opportunity for us to hear that. Does anyone have any quick questions for either Chief Gray or
I have a
Dr.
question.
Spivey? I heard a yes.
I have a question for especially for the chief, but maybe not only for the chief. So given that your tribe has been dealing with these kinds of issues for a long time in the same place, and this is a hard kind of hypothetical, but if you had at your disposal, you know, kind of as many options as maybe you used to have, what would your tradition or your culture indicate would be potential solutions to this problem, and what lessons do you think they propose for us?
You're asking me questions that I might defer to Ashley on that. exactly what we want to do. Her closing remarks basically covered a lot. You know, we consider the whole area, and our resources are limited, and we want to work with all the great people that are in this room and other ones to help us. We need help, and we want to provide our input and our help to all your agencies as needed. If Ashley has anything else to say.
So are you asking, like, if we had basically infinite availability of resources, what will we do, or what we want to see done?
Yeah, I mean, is there a lesson, say, from your culture or from your tradition?
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, I'll talk to my grandfathers saying, he had mentioned George Major, Tecumseh, Deerfoot, and Warren. That's all my grandfathers. So I come from a long tradition of being a part of this history and knowing this history. But he always said, and other fishermen said, that when you take, you always have to give back. You know, it's this idea of understanding that there's a balance, and we are way out of balance right now on so many levels. So just taking that advice from our elders, that if you're gonna take and take and take, no wonder these things are happening, right? You know, people shouldn't be shocked that any of us are dealing with what we're dealing with right now. So finding that balance and respecting what we've been given and taking care of that, that's a lesson. I don't know what that looks like on the ground. Our shad hatchery was an example, but.
Hi. So I was wondering, insofar as that you all seem to be creating a template of how a small community can have a large impact, are you using media? What ways are you reaching out so that others can maybe replicate some of what you're doing, given that you are this small community and there are many more other small communities along these tributaries who could learn from you?
Well, I know right now, like part of the project of the Living Shoreline we're building, working with VIMS, is to make that an educational opportunity for others to come and see what we do. We've even just a couple months ago, we worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and BIA and installed a weather station on the reservation, automated weather station. We want to make that open for educational opportunities and let people come and see what we're doing. So we're open to showing what we do and sharing our ideas.
Or here, for example, today.
Yeah.
That was a strategic effort to get in front of all of you. And again, I can't thank Angela and Elizabeth enough for inviting us to be here today to give us this platform. So going to events like this, conferences like this, engaging with folks like this to help tell our story and give examples of kind of what we're doing on a grassroots level in many cases. I would love to see more media. I just don't know if the media cares about what we're doing, unfortunately. I would love to be one of the PR team folks for the tribe.
Another job?
Yes. About sharing, what we're doing through the Tribal Resource Center. And we do have a museum on the reservation as well. I should mention that. It is open to the public. That's one way for folks to come and learn about not only our history, but about what our community looks like today and what we're doing today.
I think it's really cool how Native communities view environmental and cultural resources as one of the same, and it's really useful for conservation and these kind of efforts that we're all talking about today. Do you think that's a viable tool for non-Native people as well, or have you met resistance kind of proposing that concept to people outside the tribe?
I'm glad that you asked that question. I think that looking at natural resources, from species to plants to landscapes, as being a part of our cultural fabric as human beings is totally resonant with all communities. It's not just a Native thing. I think that, I know some of the delegates and some of the other presenters were talking about issues with community outreach and engagement. Maybe if they come from that grassroots, that bottom to the top level, where they really try to understand the culture and history of that particular community and how the natural environment plays into that, would be extremely helpful in moving some of these initiatives forward.
Thank you again. I think that the last comment of Dr. Spivey in her presentation about how can we take and take and take and then be surprised by the way things are today, there's a lot of wisdom in that for all of us, so thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you. All right.